Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Yang from ADL Ventures. It's great to have contestants in the American-made challenges here joining us. We're going to talk today about the solar industry, and we're going to talk about creating a foundation for bankability at scale. And so where we want to start is with this first slide is the definition of bankability. What does it mean? You've probably heard the word a lot, and you've maybe heard it used both correctly and incorrectly in a variety of ways. At the solar project level, bankability really means securing some type of financing, typically from a third party because the developer is not able or willing to pay up front. So for prize applicants like yourself, this also means that the third party investor is actually investing in all the products and services being used for the project. We have a quote here from PV Evolution Labs. This is one of the first and largest solar test labs focused on bankability related studies. And the definition is fairly simple and clear. You'll see here, financiers are willing to invest in the technology because data has indicated the quality and long-term durability, as well as the trustworthiness of the supplier. So traditionally, this is applied most commonly to solar modules and other components. But with cybersecurity becoming an increasing concern in the energy industry, don't assume that software and other service offerings such as artificial intelligence can avoid this hurdle. So in this slide, we'll talk about solar project financing. I think this is really the foundation for understanding bankability, and I think this is the foundation for understanding how and when to provide the underlying data that's going to get financiers comfortable. Of course, the most simple transaction in solar is a cash-based transaction. So if you think about the popular expression straight cash, there's nowhere where cash is straighter and more simple than in a solar project, because when you think about a business or a homeowner using the power to pay for the system up front, that is absolutely the simplest and quickest transaction flow you can have in solar. And actually, in this case, bankability is somewhat non-existent. It's solely the choice of the system owner, usually with some input from their installer, what components to use. That's why we'll talk about later in this session about why cash-based projects and installers who deal in cash-based projects actually can be great early adopters for products like some of the ones you guys are developing. Then there's a third-party financed project. The reality is over 90% of solar projects in the US are third-party financed because, perhaps when you're rich and you have the resources, you do a cash transaction. But most people, whether they're businesses or individuals, are not able to be in that situation. So the most common structure for a finance project is a power purchase agreement. This is where a developer builds a project, sells the project to an investor, and the investor sells power to the user. In most cases, the user is also the host site for the project, but this may not be true in the case of something like community solar, where multiple buyers are often subscribing to power coming from a solar farm in a remote location. A simple example based on the structure depicted here in this diagram from DOE's Better Buildings Initiative would be something like installing a rooftop solar project at Walmart and selling the project to an investor who then sells the power back to Walmart. On this slide, we're going to talk about standards for bankability. The standards for bankability traditionally have applied mainly to panels and inverters. But again, don't assume that any component, whether it's a balance of system component or a service offering related to the project, is actually immune from this type of due diligence. More and more projects today actually rely on an approved vendor list, or what's called a white list. This could be provided by a third-party engineering consultant, such as PV Evolution Labs, Black & Veatch, or DNV, or it could come from a research firm such as Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Certainly for solar cells and modules, Bloomberg New Energy Finance has emerged as a de facto standard for many large project investors, because the project investors also are heavily reliant on Bloomberg for other market data. And in this world, if you're not a tier one module vendor, you're often unlikely to sell into the largest project developers with any success at all. Now we're going to get into the sometimes complicated and tricky question of what goes into a company and product being bankable. As it pertains to NREL's prizes, the most important thing you should be thinking about today, even in the early phases like ready and set, is long-term performance data. Technical assistance from NREL and other connectors can actually be very useful here in the near term, because how your product or service performs in a real-world environment, and any indication you have of that, even at a very early stage with prototypes, will absolutely be the most important factor in evaluation for most potential vendors in solar projects. However, it's important to remember that any checklist for PV bankability usually goes well beyond product performance, as shown in this slide. At the end of the day, you're selling not only a product or service, but you're selling a company with a plan and vision. And in fact, you're often selling yourself because you're the one that's developing the relationship with the customers. So you'll see some common checklist items here for PV bankability, again, provided by PV Evolution Labs, which has done a lot of work for the largest project developers in the industry. First and foremost, for companies at this stage, there's the question of, does your company have a high survival probability, and will you actually be successful? This is particularly true for any product carrying a long-term warranty and a potential need for replacement or updating. Again, at first glance, this may sound relevant only to components, but think about how many features and security updates a typical software program requires, and you'll then realize that this requirement is not just limited to hardware. Of course, this particular video we're doing today is a little bit less focused on how companies are actually funded. ADL has other learning modules covering various aspects of this topic. But as it pertains to meeting the needs of project investors specifically, I would just recommend that you be prepared to share things like financial statements, the ownership structure of your company, and who your investors and board members are. Sometimes some projections regarding revenue and how long the money that you have for your current funding will last will also be introduced in the process. And of course, we provide this information with the understanding that many companies in the prize are actually bootstrapped and self-funded today. I've been in both that position as well as heavily venture funded. And I would say for the self-funded entrepreneur, customer and partner references are also key. A credible customer who vouches not only for things like on-time delivery and quality, but also your ability to respond to complaints and issues is priceless. I think what you're looking for is not a perfect reference, but a reference that reflects well on you as an able, dynamic, and responsive customer. In fact, some of the best situations for building customer value actually result from things like quality issues, returns, and other unexpected situations. So if you're a company applying for an NREL prize, how do you get from a prototype to this Bloomberg Tier 1 list or some other notion of large-scale bankability? First of all, be patient and remember that building a company and commercializing a product is a step-by-step progression. In legacy sectors like buildings, energy, and transportation, even getting a pilot project can be a huge accomplishment relative to what other technologies in your space have or have not achieved. At ADL Ventures, a lot of our work in supporting corporates and startups relates to optimizing that first customer interface. How can a corporate be an effective first customer and resolve a pressing problem statement for themselves in the process? How can startups sell and deliver effectively to early adopters? For those of you applying to these prizes, it's very important to remember that you must achieve success with early adopters before you will see any type of mass market adoption. I would recommend a common startup book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. However, more importantly, use this as an opportunity to brainstorm on the fly about who your early adopters might actually be in solar. So some good examples might be DIY contractors. Many of these people own their own business and essentially are their own business and have sole decision-making power over what to install. And more importantly, may have some interest or passion in new technologies, which is part of the reason why they're engaged in the industry at a small scale. Certainly larger and more professional installers who can introduce your products via cash-based projects, as we talked about, that could be a very important mechanism. Again, many of these businesses may be self-financed or self-owned rather than having to answer to a corporate board and or corporate investors. And again, they may be doing smaller cash-based systems where there aren't project investors as well. So removing those extra layers of approval is always important. And then I think another subtlety to think about here is that these customers, particularly if they're credible in the markets they work in, can advocate for you in project financing. Often an installer who does both cash and finance projects will be your first foot in the door for PPA projects as well. It could be through a small commercial project. It could be through something as simple as doing a pilot project on the owner's house. So I'll use the words of Joe Lasseter. He's a legendary entrepreneurial marketing professor and a mentor of mine who was actually one of the first people to do business research in the clean energy area. And one of the things Joe talks about a lot with early adopters is you want to find the buyers who other buyers ask for advice when they want something new. And I think a lot of the teaming and engagement interactions we encourage through the prize are, I think, meant to shed more light on this ecosystem and for you to find those people. So whether it's folks that you've talked to through ADL and other power connectors, whether it's some of the connectors you've worked with, whether it's some of the potential customers you've interviewed for in market discovery, I think this is where resourceful entrepreneurs find ways to get to those early adopters and then use those early adopters to build support with midstream and later adopters. In a previous webinar, we also talked about having a refined value proposition. I think honing that value proposition for the early adopters is critical. I think you have to think about, beyond just cost and performance, are there other factors you can use to attract somebody to essentially overpay for an unproven product? Is your product easier to install for someone who might have a shortage of labor? Does it look better for someone who might be trying to sell premium products at a smaller volume and higher price? Perhaps there's no better example of that than even Tesla, a very established company selling a solar roof tile that actually takes several weeks to install. People are willing to pay both a product premium and a labor premium to get a very good looking and very sleek system on their roof. Do you have a factory location or warehouse that's more closely located to your customer site? If you're selling through distribution, does your distributor provide will call pickup or other services like credit card processing that increase their ease of use? So keep in mind that with all these factors, that though technical due diligence, which is a lot of what we've talked about here today, is a necessary component of bankability, it really is insufficient if your core product or service doesn't provide value in other ways. And so again, in solar, we talk a lot about things coming down to cost, performance, and pricing. And certainly it's a commodity industry because you're selling energy. But what you'll find at the end of the day is that customers buy through relationships, and those relationships are built not only on human elements, but on a lot of business elements that actually have nothing to do with cost, performance, and price. So we've highlighted some of those here, and you may have other unique value propositions for your product that are equally important. So now we want to think about evolution beyond the first customer and bankability at larger scale. NREL's prizes are certainly a great source of initial funding and third-party credibility. The structure of the ready, set, and go phases allow for increasingly large amounts of investment, which then increase your ability to secure other private sector and grant funding. Not surprisingly, most of the longer-term checklist items for large-scale bankability require the time and money that's being raised as part of these processes. So when you think about field performance requirements for larger scale projects, they become much more strict. I think it's reasonable to expect multiple years of data, accelerated aging tests, in some cases for cells and modules, testing them to failure, and other much more rigorous evaluation than the small sample testing we mentioned before. In fact, in some cases, an entire working project will need to be audited. For manufacturers, a factory audit will often be necessary. The factory may need to meet some predetermined third-party standard like ISO 9000. There, it's as simple of a case as just providing a certificate. But I would certainly say more often, especially as you get further up the value chain in terms of scale, a third-party engineering consultant will need to spend time, in a lot of cases, multiple days in your factory auditing your products and processes. So on this slide, you actually see an example certificate of completion. This was one that I worked on when I was in the industry. We had a DNV GL, which is a very large engineering consultant, come in and do a 3-day factory audit of our 100 megawatt line in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I would note that by any standard today, a 100 megawatt factory selling into projects that are a few megawatts in scale would be considered very small, even for an emerging technology. So you should, as you scale, expect more due diligence than this, and expect the time and money that's spent on this to be potentially even more substantial. And if that doesn't turn out to be the case, be pleasantly surprised and see it as an upside. So lastly, you've made it. If you've made it to the end of this webinar, you've actually now learned how to go from having a rudimentary prototype to a fully financed solar product used in large-scale projects. In the early days of the solar industry, many of our salespeople came from other industries like semiconductors, and we would actually measure success by asking a customer to press hard and sign copies of a carbon-copied purchase order, for those of you that even know what a carbon-copied document is. Today, it might be a DocuSign or some other type of electronic acknowledgement, but the feeling of reward is really the same when you get customer validation and investor validation. So we wish you the best of luck in your prize pursuits. We hope many of you refer back to this video as you reach these success milestones, and we hope you have a wonderful experience working with NREL, ADL, the other power connectors in this prize. Have a wonderful day.